That's it. Go comatose for me, baby.
You shut your mouth when you're talking to me.
Hold it. This is getting confusing. You didn't always hate each other? There had to be some nice moments during the courtship, maybe?
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. And yesterday I kind of went over preliminarily the numbers as far as comic book industry sales for 2020. And inevitably, we got a few people in the comic book industry. Specifically, Tim Seeley is the one that does it every year. Look, it's record sales. And then people kind of dogpile on him and like, listen, the sales are being driven. The growth is being driven by manga and like graphic novels for kids. It's not DC, Marvel, what we traditionally think is the comic book like market, the backbone of it as far as North America. And people dogpiled on him. I did a little bit. I even put out a couple of memes today just to have fun with it. And, you know, and the tweets, I guess, aren't there anymore. Whatever. And in fact, some people will say, well, Wes, why do you hate Tim Seeley? Why are you ganging up on Tim Seeley? I don't hate Tim Seeley. From everything I've seen and witnessed, super rational guy. One of the few people you can engage with a dissenting opinion that will have an honest, in my opinion, conversation with you. From what I've been told by people that know him, you know, outside of the social media space, outside of, you know, comic books, you know, just go have a beer with him. Super nice guy, super normal. You know, you'd want to hang out with him and he's one of the more normal people in the comic book industry. I don't have anything against Tim Seeley, but he does this every year. Every year he sits there and says, see, everything's perfect. And there's like no shame in the comic book industry. Not everything is perfect. And it's okay to admit that. You can look at what happened in 2020, and it's amazing that traditional comic books, when I say comic books, I'm talking about Marvel, DC, Image, the independents, were so resilient, mostly on the backs of comic book retailers, in my opinion. Some of the publishers stepped up. DC Comics obviously made a big commitment, specifically to digital strategies, but also bringing a competitor for Diamond Comics on board, broke up that monopoly. That was very important. Obviously, that is going to be broken up and throw it into the wind in October. And DC really set the table for that. They're the ones that took the first step. So a lot of good things happened in response to the pandemic shutdown, and what could have been, you know, a crisis that maybe not imploded the industry, but could have hurt it much more drastically than it actually did. We're certainly seeing effects, but not nearly as many shops went under as we anticipated. We haven't really seen any publishers go out of business, and that is all great news. The comic book industry has been exceptionally resilient. And there are people out there saying, look at these numbers. It's clear that, comic books in North America are dying. When we say comic books in North America, traditional comic book companies, they're not dying. If anything, I'm shocked that it went this well. But you don't have to sit there and go, well, look, there's growth, when it's all on the backs of competitive, companies from another market. Manga is from Japan. It's created for the Japanese market. It's curated, translated, and the best stuff is put in the U.S. market, and it's doing exceptionally well. It's experiencing record growth in the U.S. market, meaning there is a thirst amongst American comic book buyers for content that they enjoy. Unfortunately, they're having to go find it in manga. When we look at like young adult and kids graphic novels, Dogman, Ready to Tell Buyers, Smile, all those kind of books, those are dominating. And you look at that sector, there aren't a whole lot of winners in there, but the winners that are there are enormous sellers. They are very, very impactful, and they bring in a lot of dollars. So your Captain Underpants, stuff like that. There's an entire generation growing up on comic books, but they aren't DC Comics. They're not Marvel Comics. They're growing up on comic books that are outside of this traditional market that has been dominated by the direct market comic shops. That's where you kind of have to go for it. And they're learning, and their buying habits are going around the direct market outside of DC and Marvel into other places that provide that content. That is not good for the long-term health and stability for comic books as far as traditional comic books in North America. And it's okay to admit that. You can have a little bit of shame in the fact that maybe the last 10, 15 years haven't gone quite as well as they should have, specifically with the rise of the MCU and the popularity of Marvel Comics characters. Has that generated sales? I believe it has. I believe that the MCU has brought people into comic shops and buying comics. But they haven't come back. It hasn't brought them in, and the current content hasn't kept them. And that's a problem. Now people are going outside of what's being produced and distributed, that's new comics, and they're going into old comics. Sales in the back issue market are skyrocketing right now. People have an unquenchable thirst for these characters and these materials, and they're having to go outside of what's being produced right now to get them, to quench that thirst. Some of that could be, and likely is, the price of U.S. comics are too high. No doubt about that. But when you have something like Batman 3 Jokers, ships 300,000 copies for issue number 1. Did it sell 300,000? I don't know. They don't track it that way. It shipped 300,000 copies that were sold to comic shops, to the direct market. Enormous success. Very expensive comic book. But people were willing to part and pay a premium dollar amount for what they perceive to be a premium product from premium creators, Jeff Johns and Jason Fabok, who have, a track record of success in delivering the goods on today's market. There aren't enough creators that can deliver that right now. And we're seeing a lot of them smartly, the ones that have built up some cachet with today's current readers are going outside of Marvel and DC because they're seeing all those characters and storylines being adapted onto the big screen, onto streaming and television, and they're taking their wares elsewhere. They're building their name on Marvel and DC and those characters. Very smart. But you see what James Tynion, what Scott Snyder, Al Ewing, and others, Donny Cates, are doing when they're taking that name that they built, they're going out to indie comics, and guess what? They're selling very well. Indie comic numbers, when you put a premier writer on there, are doing very well. There just aren't enough of them, and that's a problem. It has a lot to do with the storytelling, in my opinion. When you buy a U.S. comic for $4 or $5, you don't get a story. You get, a quarter of a story if you're lucky. Hopefully it's a 4-parter. More likely it's a 6-parter. And sometimes it's a 10-parter. So you might be paying $4 or $5 for 10% of the story. Whereas you can go get a volume of manga for $10 and you get hundreds of pages. Or you can get the Shonen Jump app for $2 and you can get unlimited access to their library digitally, and you get the new stories the day that they're released. That's an unbeatable value. Marvel, DC, and U.S. comic companies are not competitive on those grounds. They do not provide the value as far as competing with what you're getting on manga. The storytelling is too decompressed. There's too much politics and ideology being forced into stories. You can have social commentary, whatever. You can even have a political statement in a comic, but that can't be all that they're about. And there's way too much placating to the mob going on. A small subset of non-fans with very loud opinions that for the most part don't go into their comic shops and don't drive sales. You can put out a press clipping that is specifically aimed at that audience, and they will laud it and they'll be excited for it. Very rarely does that translate to sales. There are some outliers out there where comics that are built for that audience do very well. Saga is the one that jumps to mind. But there are others as well. A lot of the stuff Kieran Gillen has done, Wicked Divine, stuff like that. Obviously, people think that's worth the money and they're willing to buy it. But not enough of that stuff ever hits. But there's too much content being created for a very small percentage of the market. And then you have this other enormous part of the market that's willing to part with their dollars and maybe spend a premium on Western comic books if it's a story or a character they like. And they aren't being marketed to, they aren't being respected, and they're not getting the stories that they want to. A lot of them are abandoning comic books. If you look at comic book sales, and I'm going to go into this deeper on Friday with Purge, it looks like the sales for like the direct market and comic books floppies are pretty stagnant. But the prices have raised annually. So even if you see a little increase, it's likely there was actually a decrease in readership because they're raising the prices. What's also going on in there is that we're seeing a lot. It used to be mostly Marvel, but DC's going in on this. Boone's going in on this. Image is going in on this. Everybody is going in on marketing and promoting to speculators and hardcore collectors. So we're getting, what's the next one that's coming out? It's got 22 variant covers. It's one of the Marvel comics. 22 variant covers for not a premier character. I can't remember exactly which one it is right now. I feel embarrassed. But that's a lot of variant covers. You would expect something like that for a debut of a new villain, maybe in Iron Man on a milestone issue, or an Avengers #1, a reboot or something like that. They're doing this for all those characters now. And when you look over what James Tynion has done with Batman, he's done a great job getting people excited about Batman. His Tiny Onion newsletter is very effective. He gets the word out and people come in and buy his comics. He's just creating wholesale new characters. And a lot of them are duplicates of old characters. Like, how many versions of Joker do we need? How many knockoffs of Harley Quinn do we need? How many knockoffs of Poison Ivy do we need? We'll find out because James Tynion's going to keep creating. So they're creating comics specifically for speculators. So when you got your app that says, "Oh my goodness, this is hot," and you go out there and you buy them, or you have your completionists that buy every single cover. So now they're having to buy 8 covers instead of the normal 2 and stuff like that. So I think when it's all said and done, and it's my hunch, I haven't got to look at the numbers concrete, and it might be impossible to do this. I think what we're going to find is that the audience, the paying audience, the dollars are similar and staying up there because they're inviting in the speculators, but like the reading audience itself is actually shrinking as they've found, refuge in other sources that are providing materials that they want. There's nothing wrong with being proud of yourselves when I'm talking about the U.S. comic industry, DC, Marvel, Image, and the independent circuit, of being resilient on the backs of the retailers. The retailers should be the most proud of everything. And certainly the customers as well. They went out above and beyond. They made sure they found out what their comic shops were doing. They stayed in touch. They made sure that they stayed afloat, and there was good communication out there, and really a crisis just as far as the industry is averted. Obviously, we've all gone through a crisis. And we did lose some shops, and that was very unfortunate. And some people's businesses have changed irrevocably. Why can't I say that word? There are people that had never had an online e-commerce site that rely on e-commerce now. Things have changed. We had a big change in the industry. There's nothing wrong with admitting that the Western comic market, as far as the publishers and what they're creating, isn't as healthy as it should be. But going out there and trying to claim success on the backs of other creators and other products that were created specifically for a different market, have been adapted, imported into this market, and are dominating you, is disingenuous. And you should be, have some shame. You should feel embarrassed for losing out to manga. And manga's great. And if you love manga, that's terrific. I like manga here too. I don't really cover it as much as I should. I probably should cover it more in the future. But those products aren't created for an American audience. DC, Marvel, Image, the independent circuit, those are all created for an American audience. There's exponential growth happening outside of what's being created for your own audience. People are abandoning and having to go find what they want from materials that were created for another audience. It's okay to admit that you can change, but until they're actually willing to do that and have a little bit of foresight and willingness to admit that there have been mistakes along the way. They've writing for the trades has gone too far. It's writing for the omnibus now. That maybe inserting so much ideology and politics into every storyline and every character hasn't worked out. That changing and adjusting, the backbone and core of a lot of these characters to adjust your own core beliefs hasn't worked out well. That hiring based on surface traits outside of the industry has not worked out well for the most part. There's been a couple of successes here or there. That these things, these initiatives have been unsuccessful. You can continue to try them, but continue to do them the way that they are now is not going to work. It's proven to not work. And the nonstop events coming out of Marvel, the constant reboots, the never-ending changing of artists, and the price hikes are dwindling the audience year after year. It doesn't have to be that way. There is plenty of evidence out there that people have an unquenchable thirst for comic book materials. Look at what's happened with manga. There's an entire generation being raised on comic book materials. Look at Dogman. Look at Smile. We've got an entire generation of young girls ready to come up and read comic books. They're not going to be DC, Marvel, Image. They're going to go outside to other markets unless you can provide compelling materials that get people excited, that that welcome these new readers in. I think that DC and Marvel and Image probably think in a few years, once these young readers that have been raised on Dogman, Smile, and all these books, and they're coming in now, that they've been planting the seeds for this audience. They've got all this materials just waiting for them. I don't think so. The U.S. comic industry right now doesn't have a good reputation for providing good value for your money. I think that they're going to go out to manga. I think that they're going to go get Shonen Jump. Comics are too expensive. Just because you believe that you've been marketing and writing for this audience doesn't mean that you have them already. You have to work harder. So that's what I think. Have a little bit of shame. Admit you've made some mistakes and readjust your strategies. It's clear there's winners and losers in today's market. Manga is the winner right now. The Western comic market, exceptionally resilient. We lost far fewer shops than I ever would have anticipated, and that's great. Hopefully we'll experience some growth soon. And hopefully they can figure out the digital thing, but claiming that manga sales are the same thing as DC and Marvel is disingenuous. It's a loser argument. Not that it's a losing argument. It's an argument that a loser would make. Ford Motor Company saying, well, look, the sales from Honda are really good. It doesn't matter what we're doing. The entire industry, hey, I get to claim those kind of success. It doesn't work that way. Look inside your own house and see what's not working out and see if you can fix it. That's what I got to say. Have a little shame. And maybe you could work a little harder, be a little bit more introspective, and realize some of the mistakes that have been made along the way. That's what I say.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.